Bath is a golden city, gracefully draped over the steep sides of a Cotswold valley carved out by the River Avon, travelling its course to the sea. As the sun rises and another day dawns, the story of Bath continues. Many tourists will come to visit the well-known sites, the Roman remains, the famous baths, and the hot springs giving Bath its status as a spa. The Romans certainly made their mark here, but the elegant Georgian buildings which dominate present-day Bath belong to an extraordinary period of history. The connections between Bath and Jane Austen range from the purely coincidental to the extremely tangible. Coincidentally, Jane was born in the year that Bath's world-famous Royal Crescent was completed. Far more tangible is the fact that Jane's great-great-uncle, the Duke of Chandos, who visited Bath when it was still a rather cramped, squalid city in the early 1720s, saw it had potential. The Duke hired a young, ambitious architect called John Wood to redesign St. John's Hospital for him. This was John Wood's first step to a complete recreation of Bath. He was a visionary who overcame the difficulties of speculative building and, with the help of his son John Wood the Younger, fulfilled his ambition, in his own words, building a new Rome, achieving design in harmony with genteel function. When Jane Austen moved to Bath in 1801, she certainly failed to appreciate John Wood's noble intentions. On her arrival in the May of that year, she described Bath as being
all vapour, shadow, smoke and confusion.
Neither did the city improve for her on further acquaintance. However, for anyone wishing to study the society that Jane Austen lived in, Bath stands as a testament to every facet of life in her day. It was here in Bath that Richard Beau Nash laid down manners and etiquette for a more civilised code of behaviour which would sweep the nation. As a result, the city was home to many distinguished people of the day. The young Nelson lived in Pierpont Street, Oliver Goldsmith in North Parade, Josiah Wedgwood lived in Gay Street, and Samuel Wilberforce, famous for the abolition of slavery, lived at Great Pulteney Street. Sheridan lived in the Royal Crescent, and anyone who was anyone visited the city. Dr. Johnson, Alexander Pope, Wordsworth, Gainsborough, Mary Wollstonecraft, and Sir Walter Scott, to name but a few. Every one of these people represent aspects of Jane Austen's society. They were the thinkers of the day, whether artists, writers, architects, scientists, theologians, soldiers or politicians. Jane Austen herself did much to capture the essence of the period in her novels. She was also a prolific letter writer, particularly in her correspondence with her older sister Cassandra, and it is these letters that have helped us to a better understanding of life at the turn of the 18th and 19th century. Today's Bath, busy with people going about their business, independently declining the entreaties from cafes and restaurants to take morning coffee or afternoon tea, preferring to eat whatever they choose whenever they feel hungry. It's hard to imagine what Jane Austen would make of the sheer variety of food available, and if she glanced at the newspaper stands, she would definitely be in for a shock. The salacious nature of tabloid stories may fail to interest these people rushing from place to place, but for Jane, the fact that a vast amount of the subject matter relates to the present-day royal family would have been beyond belief. As a young woman, Jane would have been aware of the satirical cartoons drawn by James Gilray, which did little to flatter George III and his family. No matter how amusing these may have been, the activities of the royal family still had a great influence on people's everyday lives, and could provide a real cause for concern. For this reason, the royal family is an appropriate aspect of Jane Austen's society to begin with. George III had been king for 15 years when Jane Austen was born on the 16th of December 1775. He was the first Hanoverian monarch to be born in England, the son of Frederick, Prince of Wales. Prince Frederick died in 1751, which was no doubt a relief to his father, King George II, who would have been much happier about being succeeded by his grandson George III. Frederick's parents both absolutely loathed him. In fact, his mother, Queen Caroline, was said to have been comforted on her deathbed by the thought that she would never see that monster again. Early in his reign, George III developed an interest in the study of agriculture, earning himself the nickname of Farmer George. This may explain why Jane Austen was so familiar with the concept of the gentleman farmer, which he uses so evocatively in her novel Emma. George III married Princess Charlotte in 1761, when she was just 18 years old. They met at St. James's Palace 6 hours before their wedding. It was a successful marriage, producing 15 children, with the king remaining completely faithful to his queen. He was a well-respected monarch, and when he became ill in 1788, there was genuine concern for his well-being throughout the country. The nature of his condition, progressively worsening mental derangement, was a mystery to his doctors, who made his life a misery with barbaric treatments, including the use of a straitjacket. Medical science has since diagnosed him as suffering from porphyria, a hereditary physical illness with symptoms including delirium and delusions, giving every impression of madness. This letter, written by Jane from her home in Chawton in 1811, after the king had been particularly ill, shows just how great an impact royal events could have upon the lives of ordinary people.
I had just left off writing and put on my things for walking to Alton, when Anna and her friend Harriet called in on their way thither, so we went together. Their business was to provide mourning against the king's death, and my mother has had bombazine bought for her. I'm not sorry to be back again, for the young ladies had a great deal to do, and without much method in doing it.
Mrs. Austen was altogether more enthusiastic about the matter than her daughter. She had shrewdly worked out that
black funereal bombazine would be cheaper now than when the poor king is actually dead.
Always known for her practical if not tactful nature, Mrs. Austen went on to comment,
"If I outlive him, it will answer my purpose, and if I do not, somebody may mourn for me in it. It will be wanted for one or the other, I dare say, before the moths have eaten it up."
The king surprised everyone, living on to the age of 81, eventually dying in 1820, surviving 3 years longer than Jane Austen herself, as she died in July of 1817. The relapse he suffered in 1810, however, did effectively end any power to rule for George III. In 1811, the Regency Act was passed, and the Prince of Wales, the future George IV, took charge. One problem common to the Hanoverian kings seems to have been their inability to get on with their sons. As we've already heard, George III's father, Frederick, was hated by his father, George II, and George III developed a dislike for his son, George IV, while he was still a boy. George III suffered great disappointment over the behaviour of all of his sons. Each of them got into debt, married or lived with unsuitable women, and produced illegitimate children. After 40 years on the throne, George III, father of 15 children, could only claim one legitimate grandchild. For a man of high personal standards, whose views were sympathetic to a natural moral order, this was a tragedy. The Austen family shared the widely held view that the first duty of government was to preserve order, and this was just about maintained during the reign of George III. But With the birth of the Regency, a wind of change would blow through every level of society. Jane Austen's novels were all published during the Regency period, and some of the more outrageous behaviour of the prince may have made Jane take a stronger moral stand in her novels. This letter, which Jane wrote from Steventon in 1798, proves that she had kept an eye on the prince's affairs long before he became regent.
I have changed my mind and changed the trimmings of my cap this morning. They are now such as you suggested. I felt as if I should not prosper if I strayed from your directions, and I think it makes me look more like Lady Conyngham now than it did before, which is all that one lives for now.
Lady Conyngham was one of the prince's influential mistresses. There were a succession of mistresses throughout his life. He even entered into a marriage ceremony with twice-widowed Catholic Mrs. Maria Fitzherbert. The prince was only 23, and Mrs. Fitzherbert 28. He certainly seemed to prefer older, more experienced women, and as Maria refused to be his mistress, he married her. The marriage was kept secret, because the bride's Catholic faith made it invalid. One image that Jane Austen uses quite strikingly in her novels is that of immoral deeds leading to financial ruin. Was this based on Prince George? In 1795 his debts amounted to a quite staggering £630,000, and the only way out of it was to marry a German princess of his father's choosing. The marriage to his cousin Caroline of Brunswick was a disaster, and within months the couple had parted in a very public and acrimonious manner, but George's debts had been settled by Parliament. It was his treatment of his wife that perhaps upset Jane Austen the most. Jane didn't live long enough to see George IV become king, but she would have seen it as appropriate that he lost much of his popularity when he had the would-be Queen Caroline excluded from his coronation. Caroline died only a few weeks later, and the couple's only daughter, and George III's only legitimate grandchild, Princess Charlotte, died in childbirth. There was a more cultured side to the Prince Regent, and he did much to further public interest in the arts. He was also a great patron of architecture, the Regent's Park area of London being an example of his taste. The Prince employed the skills of architect John Nash to design and build these gracious houses. Unlike the houses that John Wood built in Bath, which applied the classical principles throughout, these are glorious facades, with surprisingly plain interiors. John Nash was also the architect responsible for the urban planning, which divided London into east and west. He laid out Trafalgar Square, built the elegant columns of the Mall, and used the stylish curves of Regent Street to split the desirable residents of the West from the poverty and squalor of Soho and the East. The most famous London landmark of today, Buckingham Palace, received the Nash treatment as well. George III had bought Buckingham House for the grand sum of £28,000 in 1762, with a view to replacing the dust trap of St James's Palace. However, it was George IV who commissioned Nash to redesign the house after his father's death in 1820. Rumour has it that George IV was rather partial to the wife of John Nash, which perhaps explains why it took until 1837 to complete. From this time forward, Buckingham Palace has been the official London residence of every British sovereign. When we look at the areas of London which John Nash created and the areas of Bath which John Wood created, the style of building is influenced by classical form. This type of architecture is predominantly featured in the novels of Jane Austen. The classicism we see displayed in Jane Austen's writing flourished between 1750 and 1830, and it is the period of architecture most appropriate to her own life. Architecture in this category is often referred to as neoclassical, purely to distinguish it from the classicism of ancient Greece and Rome, which of course are the source of its origins. To put this into context, we need to look at the styles which had preceded the fine Palladian building of Jane's day. Sir Christopher Wren typifies the English Baroque, which dominated the 17th century and still took its inspiration from Rome. St. Paul's Cathedral is a prime example, as are Blenheim Palace and Castle Howard, both the work of Sir John Vanbrugh, and both, we suspect, visited by Jane Austen. The 18th century saw the birth of a new style, Rococo, which rejected the massive, heavy relief of the Baroque in favour of a lighter and more elegant manner of building and decoration. Rome was no longer the major architectural influence, as Paris had become the artistic centre of Europe, and some of the best examples of the Rococo style can be seen in the chateaux and churches of France. The elegance which had begun with Rococo continued, and the fashionable young men who took the grand tour through Europe could count young architects among their number. Robert Adam was perhaps the most influential, translating the Roman remains he had witnessed in Italy into a new age of British architecture. Although the John Woods are the most famous architects of Bath, Robert Adam has left his mark here too. He designed and built the Pulteney Bridge, completing the project in 1774. Adam also had grand plans for a new Bathwick estate joined to the main city by his bridge. His neoclassical dreams were halted by the outbreak of war with America in 1775. Speculative building was hit hard, and when work on the Bathwick estate resumed in the late 1780s, it was Thomas Baldwin who took the project over. The French Revolution stopped Baldwin in his tracks, with its financial implications bankrupting many speculative builders. Thomas Baldwin was unfortunately one of them. While Bath was revelling in the elegance of neoclassicism, a new style of architecture was developing. The Gothic revival, which looked to medieval times for inspiration, started to become popular in the mid-1750s. There was an interesting overlap in styles at this time, with Sir John Vanbrugh, the great Baroque architect, being one of the first to build a house with a castle air. Robert Adam is also known to have been employed at Strawberry Hill, the great Gothic fantasy of Hugh Walpole. Jane Austen uses the Gothic imagery very effectively in her novel Northanger Abbey. Jane would have seen many houses embellished with battlements and turrets, as well as the building of folly castles and mock ruins to enhance a landscape. It is a folly castle that Jane uses in Northanger Abbey to set her readers a clue as to the true nature of one of her characters. John Thorpe has designs upon the heroine of the novel, Catherine Morland, and he invites her to visit Blaise Castle. Blaise Castle, as Jane Austen would have known, was built in 1766, and this is an example of Jane's playful style, teasing her readers. What she's doing is warning her reader of John Thorpe's phony character, his charm no more than a facade, making him in reality less than he pretends to be, just like Blaise Castle. "Blaise Castle?" cried Catherine. "What is that?" "The finest place in England, worth going 50 miles at any time to see." "What, is it really a castle, an old castle?" "The oldest in the kingdom." No look at the architecture of Jane Austen's day would be complete without considering the Royal Pavilion at Brighton. This was a simple farmhouse when the Prince of Wales bought it in 1786 for his secret bride, Mrs. Fitzherbert. Under the Prince's direction, it was firstly renovated as a neoclassical villa by architect Henry Holland. Then William Porden furnished it in Oriental style, also adding an Indian-style dome. It was John Nash of Buckingham Palace fame who was finally called upon to incorporate the dome into the rest of the building. This he did in a bizarre fashion, adding the famous onion-shaped domes and mini pagodas, mixing influences of the East with French style. The whole process took 35 years, and the Prince Regent and his friends turned the little seaside resort of Brighthelmstone into the fashionable seaside town of Brighton. The pavilion certainly added to the debts of the Prince Regent, and many of his friends, who he had encouraged to put money into the project, faced financial ruin. For the royal set, keeping up with the prince was an expensive business. The most famous man of fashion at the time, Beau Brummel, also suffered financial ruin, despite being a close friend of the prince. This cartoon by Gilray comments on how over-the-top fashion had become. Also, he implies that manners and style hide the true nature of mankind. The society which the prince and his entourage brought to Brighton would have appeared as polite and civilised, but at a distance from the eyes of authority in London, behaviour would have been pretty wild. Gambling was rife, and many people lost huge fortunes at the gaming tables. This was true for both men and women. Chatsworth House, the seat of the Devonshires, was rumoured to have been at risk because of the gambling habits of the 5th Duchess Georgiana. Gambling was not the only vice, and we only have to consider the Prince Regent's list of mistresses to appreciate this. Apart from the financial and moral consequences of the dual standards of society, another unpleasant phenomena was developing. The Regency fop. When Beau Nash set out his rules for civilised behaviour, great progress was made. Bath became a safe and tasteful place to be, where refined visitors went for amusement. By the time that Beau Brummel had reached the dizzy heights of fashion, Beau Nash's ideals had been taken to ridiculous extremes, resulting in effete young men, so caught up with manners, fashion and social niceties that they lacked any moral or intellectual substance whatsoever. Their tastes were expensive, and they preyed on heiresses to fund their habits. Jane Austen was well aware of them, and the character of George Wickham in Pride and Prejudice owes much to the fops of the day. Brighton was robbed of the presence of many of these characters when George IV abruptly abandoned his seaside creation in 1827. He never returned, and the reason for his departure was the Lady Conyngham of Jane's earlier letter. Diamond-cut graffiti about her, carved into one of the pavilion's window panes, caused her so much offence she refused to ever go back to Brighton again. Just as Bath had developed because of the reputed benefits to health of the spa waters, the new seaside town of Brighton had been advocating the health benefits of seawater since 1750. In one of her letters, Jane Austen mentions sea bathing, but in her case feels that spending too long in the water may have been detrimental.
The bathing was so delightful this morning, and Molly so pressing with me to enjoy myself, that I believe I stayed in rather too long, as since the middle of the day I have felt unreasonably tired. I should be more careful another time.
Therefore, whether it be seawater or spa water, attempting to find cures for various ailments was evidently a developing trend for the society in which Jane Austen lived. Jane Austen visited Bath in 1799, when her brother Edward and his family were there to take the waters, in the hope of finding a cure for his gout. Jane writes this report of his progress for Cassandra.
He was better yesterday than he had been for 2 or 3 days before. About as well as he was at Steventon. He drinks from the Hetling pump, is to bathe tomorrow, and try electricity on Tuesday. He proposed the latter himself to Dr. Fellows, who made no objection to it. but I fancy we are all unanimous in expecting no advantage from it.
This letter from Jane Austen typifies the medical vagaries of the day. All treatments were rather hit and miss, with the majority of families relying upon their own traditional remedies and nursing skills. The Austen family would have had access to a professional medical man for serious illness, but his success would not have been guaranteed. When Jane became seriously ill, with what we now know to have been Addison's disease, Mr. Lyford, a surgeon of good repute, was engaged to treat her. Although he was obviously confident of curing her, Jane was realistically unconvinced.
Mr. Lyford says he will cure me, and if he fails I shall draw up a memorial and lay it before the Dean and Chapter, and have no doubt of redress from that pious, learned and disinterested body.
Mr. Lyford was a surgeon, and it is interesting to consider the growth in this particular profession. By 1800, Bath could claim 18 surgeons, and the wars with both America and France had also increased the numbers of surgeons needed to help injured soldiers and sailors. The prospect of surgery without anaesthetic, as it would have been in Jane Austen's day, would have been horrific. We have one very vivid account of what it was like in the diaries of novelist Fanny Burney. In 1811, while living in France, Fanny developed pain and swelling in her breast, which was probably due to breast cancer. Her will to live must have been very strong, as she chose to have a mastectomy performed in her own kitchen, and without anaesthetic, rather than die from the cancer. This is part of her description of the 20-minute operation.
The knife went in, cutting through veins, arteries, flesh, nerves. I began a scream that lasted unintermittently during the whole time of the incision, and I almost marvel that it rings not in my ears still. The instrument, describing a curve, cutting against the grain, if I may so say, while the flesh resisted in a manner so forcible as to oppose and tire the hand of the operator. Despite this obviously gruesome experience, Fanny Burney survived another 29 years, with medical science improving all the time. Many discoveries were being made, and in this letter Jane Austen comments upon the work of Edward Jenner, a country doctor from Gloucestershire. Mrs. Bramston talked a good deal of nonsense, which Mr. Bramston and Mr. Clark seemed almost equally to enjoy. There was a whist and casino table, and 6 outsiders. Rice and Lucy made love, and Matthew Robinson fell asleep. James and Mrs. Augusta alternately read Dr. Jenner's pamphlet on the cowpox, and I bestowed my company by turns on all. Jane Austen is without doubt making a light-hearted comment here, but the work of Dr. Jenner made a tremendous contribution to public health. This is the Chantry in Berkeley, home of the famous doctor and now the Jenner Museum. Jenner had suffered from smallpox as a child, and as a country doctor he was frustrated by the number of his patients, particularly the children, who died from this terrible disease. Matters had been made worse by an early 18th century practice from the Middle East which involved inoculating healthy people with the smallpox lymph. The patient would then have the disease in a mild form and become immune. The adoption of the practice in England was encouraged by Lady Wortley Montagu, a leading social figure, but there was a big problem. The percentage of fatalities was decreased, but the number of cases increased. In 1802, a census recorded about 45,000 deaths annually from smallpox. As a young medical apprentice, Jenner encountered the belief that people who milked cows would never catch smallpox, and he never forgot about it. Later, with increased medical knowledge, he formulated the theory that cowpox would give immunity against smallpox. Therefore, when Sarah Nelms, a Berkeley milkmaid, caught cowpox in May of 1796, Jenner took some of the lymph from a pustule on her arm and vaccinated a small boy called James Phipps with it. James caught the disease, which was mild, but the great question still remained unanswered.
would James be immune to the dreaded smallpox. On the 1st of July, Jenner inoculated the boy with smallpox, and, fortunately for James, the illness did not develop. Gradually, the practice of vaccination became accepted, but as this cartoon, in the style of Gilray, shows, the public had some interesting concerns. This garden hut, known as the Temple of Vaccination, was where Jenner performed many of his inoculations. Incredible to think that such a major contribution to world health was made here, when Jane Austen was working on Pride and Prejudice. The two actually had more in common than we might at first think. Both were the children of country parsons, and both applied the principle of careful observation to great effect. More importantly, though, were the results of that observation. For Jenner, the potential eradication of smallpox, and for Jane, the immortality of her characters, still continue to earn both of them recognition in the 20th century. For the women of Jane Austen's society, there was a threat to health that was even more common than smallpox, and at every level of society it was accepted as a woman's lot. We are of course talking about pregnancy and childbirth. Although Jane didn't have children of her own, she was well aware of the problems childbearing could cause. 3 of Jane's brothers lost their first wives in childbirth, and for 2 of them it was their 11th confinement. Whether Jane Austen was a little envious of relations and friends who had children, we can only guess. But some of her sharpest, perhaps even cruel comments were made about this subject. One poor lady, whose baby was born dead, incited this remark:
Mrs. Hall of Sherborne was brought to bed of a dead child some weeks before she expected, owing to a fright. I suppose she happened unawares to look at her husband.
Jane Austen had some helpful advice about birth control to offer as well, which is interesting when you consider how sheltered her own life was. In one case she recommends that if all else failed, the couple in question should adopt the simple regime of separate rooms. Jane's nieces were also given some sensible advice by their observant aunt. Fanny Knight received this recommendation in a letter from Jane.
By not beginning the business of mothering quite so early in life, you will be young in constitution, spirits, figures, and countenance.
Another niece, Anna Lefroy, obviously failed to put her aunt's wise words into practice. Anna married in 1814, and by the March of 1817 was expecting her 3rd child. It was certainly quite common for a woman to produce a child every year, so Anna was not doing anything unusual for the time. But Jane, although sympathetic, is a little scathing when she says,
Poor animal, she'll be worn out before she's 30.
However, before a young lady of Jane Austen's day and social standing could aspire to the delights of motherhood, she needed to get herself suitably married. If we look closely at Jane's novels, we soon discover the major elements governing matrimony had more to do with money than love. This was beginning to change, though, and throughout the 18th century, courtship was becoming an important facet of life for young people who were exercising the right to choose for themselves. The novel developed at this time principally to chronicle this new trend, and although some popular authors trivialized the medium, Jane Austen made an art form out of writing about the trials and tribulations involved with aspirations to the matrimonial state. The manners of courtship and marriage were well established, and anyone who flouted these would usually run into difficulty. The code of behaviour was set out to defend a lady's reputation, and when Marianne, in Sense and Sensibility, defies convention, she pays a very high price. Marianne is of the same social class as Jane, so the only option open to her is that of a safe marriage. This letter, which Jane wrote before moving to Bath, enjoys a joke about the breaking of marital convention, but it does involve females, of an inferior social standing.
We plan having a steady cook and a young giddy housemaid, with a sedate middle-aged man who is to undertake the double office of husband to the former and sweetheart to the latter. No children to be allowed on either side.
As Jane grew older, she evidently became more cynical about men and marriage, and in this letter rates the acquisition of a husband alongside the acquisition of a pair of shoes.
Mrs. Blount was the only one much admired. She appeared exactly as she did in September, with the same broad-faced, diamond bandeau, white shoes, pink husband and fat neck.
Jane Austen certainly had the opportunity to marry, but she chose to remain single rather than marry without affection. The fact that Jane Austen could accept her lot as a single woman had much to do with the early rumblings of feminism that was shaping the female expectations of the time. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which was published in 1792 when Jane was just 16 years old. Mary argued that girls should not be educated purely to attract a husband, suggesting that they'd be better served if they were taught how to be good wives and mothers. This proves that Jane Austen was not the only female of her day who recognised the potential of women if they were allowed to put their intelligence to a use beyond finding a husband. Mary Wollstonecraft eloquently notes that
the civilised women of the present century, with few exceptions, are only anxious to inspire love when they ought to cherish a nobler ambition, and by their abilities and virtues exact respect.
In 1798, Mary died, ironically giving birth to her daughter, Mary Godwin, who would grow up to marry the poet Shelley and write Frankenstein. Unfortunately for the cause of feminism, after her death, Mary Wollstonecraft was discovered to have led an unusual and immoral life, having had an illegitimate child as a result of an affair. She was also an atheist, which gave the religious leaders of the day the opportunity to discredit her and her cause. The Reverend Richard Polwell, in an anti-feminist publication, described the sparkle of confident intelligence as being proof of immodesty in a female. Needless to say, the cause of feminism may have been brought to light by Mary Wollstonecraft, but it was also set back by her quite considerably as well. Society was undergoing great change, and even though Mary's behaviour damaged the cause of women's rights, life was changing for the common man. Thomas Paine published The Rights of Man in 1791, which attacked privilege and inherited wealth. He also suggested some pretty radical reforms: old age pensions, family allowances, and education for all. The work was dedicated to George Washington, the first President of the United States of America. The American War of Independence grew out of the British government wanting the best of all worlds. On the one hand, they wanted the American settlers to run their own administration, and on the other, they wanted to increase the taxes that the settlers paid, resulting in the famous cry of "no taxation without representation." War broke out in 1775, the year of Jane's birth, with independence being declared on the 4th of July, 1776. When we look at the Declaration, it is easy to understand why Tom Paine admired the principles behind it and echoed them in his Rights of Man. It stated that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, also did much to reinforce Paine's thinking. The war with Britain, which resulted, was declared in 1792. For 9 years the revolutionaries fought hard, but made little progress, until Napoleon became France's leader. With Napoleon as its military commander and emperor, the war continued until the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Jane Austen was 17 when this war started, and nearly 40 when it ended. This perhaps goes some way to explaining the shortage of good men in her novels, as well as in her own life. Over 20 years at war with France not only caused stress for young ladies in search of husbands, it also put a great deal of pressure on the political system of the day. William Pitt, the younger, was Prime Minister from 1783 to 1801 and 1804 to 1806. He was a Tory who would have enjoyed the support of the Austen family as he championed the cause of the established order. Throughout George III's bouts of illness, he opposed the regency, remaining loyal to the king. The opposition, the Whigs, were led by Charles Fox, a keen supporter of the Prince Regent. There were some stormy battles between these two politicians, as Fox stood for reform and even supported some of the ideals of the French Revolution. James Gilray did much to raise the public perception of politics with his satirical cartoons, sold as prints and accessible to people of every class in society. Even the illiterate could understand the sting in James Gilray's tale. If politics could be relied upon to provoke a good argument in Jane Austen's day, then so could religion. In Jane Austen's household, the developments affecting the church would have come under much greater scrutiny than the politics of the day, simply because of the family connection. Jane's father, the Reverend George Austen, went into the church after university, just as other young educated men went into the law or the army. The church was a profession which offered stability, and Jane's oldest brother James became a clergyman. When her favourite brother Henry, the entrepreneur of the family, became bankrupt, he fell back on a career in the church, taking over the living at Steventon, the parish of his father and brother before him. Although the Austen clergymen were undoubtedly good men, it was pretty hit or miss as to whether the local upholder of the faith was decent or not. There was also a practice of granting the living from a church to an absentee clergyman who would rarely visit his parish. It was against this background that a new movement was growing throughout the length and breadth of the land. By the end of the 18th century, Methodism and its fiery advocate John Wesley had made their mark. Wesley travelled far and wide, preaching personal salvation through the blood of Jesus Christ. Many people were saved and sent on their way, equal to any man in the sight of God. As far as religion was concerned, God was back, and the established church was very wary of his presence. Wesley had a calling. He visited Bath, for example, 80 times to preach to the ungodly gamblers who frequented the city. In 1809, Jane had obviously encountered the fervour of the evangelicals, as she says,
"I do not like evangelicals."
But by 1814, she has mellowed somewhat, seeing their absolute faith as a safe and happy way to live.
I am by no means convinced that we ought not all to be evangelicals, and am at least persuaded that they who are so far from reason and feeling must be happiest and safest.
Just as Jane Austen gradually accepted this change in religious practice, so did the rest of society, and by the time Victoria came to the throne in 1837, the English church became a symbol of empire, and missionaries travelled far and wide to spread the message of salvation. The literature of the church was published, notably sermons which could be read out loud and discussed for moral guidance. Jane Austen mentions the sermons of Fordyce in Pride and Prejudice, but we suspect this has more to do with Lydia Languish in Sheridan's The Rivals, who curled her hair with papers made out of Fordyce's sermons, than the moral words spoken by that gentleman himself. This would also suggest that religious literature was not the only writing which influenced the work of Jane Austen. As an author, Jane Austen's style had developed from extensive reading. She grew up with poetry and greatly admired it. Her mother was known to write witty verse, and Jane herself wrote lines to fortunate members of her family. The poetry which Jane would have been familiar with took two forms. Firstly, there was the formal classicism of poets like Dryden and Pope, and secondly, there was romanticism, which developed through the works of poets like Cowper and Crabbe, through to its full-blooded form with Wordsworth and Coleridge. Classical poetry was formal and precise, with conventional patterns for rhythm and rhyme, typically in the form of rhyming couplets. These are rhyming lines of equal length coupled together. This classic example of a rhyming couplet comes from Alexander Pope's Rape of the Lock. Here files of pins extend their shining rows, puffs, powders, patches, Bibles belay do. When the reader works it out, the sentiment is humorous, mixing up Bibles with beauty spots and love letters. Jane Austen would have been used to deciphering classical poetry, but she also developed a taste for the work of poets who extolled the virtues of country life. In this letter, Jane describes her father reading the work of Cowper, a great favourite of hers.
We drink tea at 6:30. I'm afraid you will despise us. My father reads Cowper to us in the evening, to which I listen when I can.
Cowper expressed the view that God made the countryside and man made the town. From what we know of Jane's thoughts on town life, she would have agreed with him wholeheartedly. Jane Austen left an interesting record of the poets and writers she admired in a very unusual place. While living at Steventon, where her father was the rector, she would take marriage certificates and fill them in, marrying herself to the men who appealed to her. George Crabbe seems to have been a favourite, and his poetry would have been in keeping with Jane's own tastes. He wrote closely observed, realistic portraits of rural life. This observation of rural life was taken even further by the new romantic movement in poetry, which was challenging the classical formality of the past. William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge were the leaders of this new style. Both of them were born a few years before Jane, and, just like Crabbe, they found their inspiration in nature. Their language may have been easier to understand, with a simple rustic quality, but surprisingly, Jane was not an admirer. Perhaps it was their moral conduct which put her off, because the story of Colonel Brandon's ward in Sense and Sensibility is not dissimilar to Wordsworth's own exploits with a young Parisian girl. The only time that Jane mentions Wordsworth is in her unfinished novel Sanditon, and as the character singing his praises is a complete idiot, we can only surmise that she was not a great fan. The Romantic movement was also influencing the world of painting, where portrait artists had been the great celebrities of the time. The rich, who could afford the well-known artists to capture their likeness, turned to Thomas Gainsborough and Sir Joshua Reynolds. Thomas and Catherine Knight, the wealthy relations who had adopted Jane's brother Edward, had their portraits painted by Romney, another well-known portrait painter of the day. Sir Joshua Reynolds did much for the development of art when he founded the Royal Academy in 1768. He hoped to copy the success of the French Academy, which had done much to improve artistic standards. Reynolds attempted to raise portraiture to a higher level, and he succeeded, using images inspired by classical mythology. The Royal Academy proved to be of great value to James Gilray and Thomas Rowlandson, the two cartoonists we have featured in this video. The Academy taught young men of no fortune but great talent, giving them a chance to study with the best teachers. Both men fitted into this category, and the fact that 200 years on their work is still appreciated says much for the artistic ideals that Sir Joshua Reynolds instigated. A romantic movement was beginning to grow in the world of painting, with the work of Constable and Turner bringing about a change that would come too late for Jane Austen to see. Both were exact contemporaries of Jane, and she would have rather enjoyed their representations of ordinary country life rather than the fine but predictable ladies and gentlemen in blue silk and brown velvet of Gainsborough. Maybe if she'd seen Constable's work on this visit to a gallery, then she might have been a little more interested.
Mary and I, after disposing of her father and mother, went to the Liverpool Museum and the British Gallery, and had some amusement at each. Though my preference for men and women always inclines me to attend more to the company than the sight.
However, for Jane Austen, music was a much more fascinating branch of the arts than painting. She loved to play the piano for her own entertainment, sharing the distaste of some of her heroines for public performances. In this letter, she expresses her joy at having her own piano.
Yes, we will have a pianoforte, as good a one as can be got for 30 guineas. And I will practise country dances, that we may have some amusement for our nephews and nieces when we have the pleasure of their company.
The formal music of Haydn, Handel and Bach would have been played by Jane, and she would also have played and sang the traditional songs which her reluctant heroines were forced to sing. But passion was on the way. Mozart, although formal and intricate in places, showed the first stirrings of passion, and Beethoven really gave full vent to his soul in the romantic spirit of the age. Music was changing to embrace the new century, moving on from the society which Jane Austen recorded so lovingly in her novels. The art of the popular novel flourished throughout Jane's lifetime. Her early preference for Fielding, Johnson and Richardson grew to include the works of Fanny Burney, the lady who experienced the horrific mastectomy we considered earlier. Fanny wrote about the entry of young women into society, with her best-known works being Evelina, Cecilia and Camilla. The title of Pride and Prejudice was, we suspect, taken from the closing chapter of Camilla. We can be pretty sure of this because the novel was published by subscription, and the list of subscribers can be found in the book. One of the names on that list is that of Miss Jane Austen of Steventon. Despite Jane's great interest in poetry, novels and literature, she was not obsessed with books, and in this reply to her friend Martha Lloyd, who has asked her to bring books on a forthcoming visit, she gives this forthright reply.
You distress me cruelly by your request about books. I cannot think of any to bring with me, nor have I any idea of our wanting them. I come to be talked to, not to read or hear reading. I can do that at home. And indeed I am now laying in a stock of intelligence to pour out on you as my share of the conversation.
This explains why Jane Austen's novels paint such a vivid picture of her society. She watched, listened and recorded the trivialities of everyday life. Whether we look at the golden buildings of Bath, the stylish palaces of London, or the busy seaside at Brighton, it is easy to fill these places with Jane's characters, dancing, walking and cutting a dash when our imaginations have been fueled by her evocative chapters. Jane Austen achieved much in her short life, when we appreciate the legacy left in her novels and letters. She painted a picture of life as she lived it, and for many people, Elizabeth Bennet, the heroine of Pride and Prejudice, with her fine eyes and sparkling wit, is the character who reveals the very essence of Jane Austen. Although many people of Jane Austen Society read her words, few knew the identity of the lady who had written them. It is ironic, then, that 200 years later, present-day society knows all about Jane Austen. She would have been delighted if she'd known that the late 20th century perception of Regency society was based upon modern televisual and cinematic interpretations of her work and her 6 precious novels in all of their original glory. These lines from Elizabeth Bennet, if they truly do reflect Jane's own wishes, can now be recognised as an ambition fulfilled.
I have always seen a great similarity in the turn of our minds. We are each of an unsocial, taciturn disposition, unwilling to speak, unless we expect to say something that will amaze the whole room, and be handed down to posterity with all the eclat of a proverb.